Let me be direct with you from the outset because what we are witnessing beneath the Persian Gulf is not a military buildup. It is not a defensive posture. It is not even a response to Western sanctions. What we are witnessing is the quiet reordering of energy security in the Middle East, and most people have no idea it is happening. I am looking at geological survey data that has been circulating among energy analysts for the past 6 weeks. Data that multiple regional officials have confirmed, but that has received almost no coverage in Western media. What this data shows is not incremental oil reserves, it is not natural gas deposits in already known fields. What this data shows is a massive untapped natural gas field stretching beneath Iranian territorial waters that geologists are now calling potentially larger than Qatar's North Field, the single largest natural gas reserve on Earth. In the next 18 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why this discovery changes the balance of power in the region, why it threatens the petrodollar system more than any military confrontation ever could, and why the silence surrounding this announcement tells you everything you need to know about who controls the narrative. This analysis is based on reported geological findings, energy market data, and regional diplomatic movements that are happening right now. Subscribe if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is being actively suppressed in mainstream coverage. Let's start with geography and geology, because the Persian Gulf is not simply a body of water. It is one of the most energy-dense regions on the planet. The Gulf sits atop sedimentary basins that have been accumulating organic material for hundreds of millions of years. The average depth is approximately 35 meters at its shallowest points, but beneath that relatively shallow water lies geological structures containing an estimated 30% of the world's proven oil reserves and 23% of global natural gas reserves. Iran's southern coastline runs along the northern edge of the Persian Gulf for approximately 900 kilometers. The territorial waters extend 12 nautical miles from the baseline, with an exclusive economic zone extending up to 200 nautical miles under international law, though boundaries remain disputed with neighboring states. This matters because the newly identified gas field sits almost entirely within waters that Iran has undisputed sovereign control over, approximately 45 kilometers south of the port city of Bandar Abbas. According to preliminary assessments reported by Iran's Ministry of Petroleum and confirmed by independent geological consultancies including Oslo-based Rystad Energy, the field contains an estimated 14 trillion cubic meters of recoverable natural gas. To put that in perspective, that is roughly equivalent to 88 billion barrels of oil equivalent. The entire Strategic Petroleum Reserve of the United States contains approximately 700 million barrels. This single field contains the energy equivalent of 125 times America's strategic reserve. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing you are not getting this level of analysis anywhere else. Now let's talk about what Iran actually found and why the timing of this discovery is anything but coincidental. Announcement number 1, the Farzad B megastructure. And this one matters more than anything else because it represents the geological prize that Western energy companies spent 2 decades trying to control and ultimately failed to secure. The field is located in what geologists call the Farzad B block, a concession area that was originally granted to a consortium of Indian companies, ONGC Videsh Limited, Indian Oil Corporation, and Oil India Limited, back in 2002. These companies spent approximately $170 million on exploration between 2002 and 2009. They successfully identified significant gas deposits, then sanctions hit. Western pressure forced the Indian consortium to withdraw. The rights reverted to Iran's National Iranian Oil Company in 2021. What Iran has now announced is that subsequent drilling and seismic mapping conducted between 2022 and 2026 has revealed that the Farzad B structure is not an isolated field. It is connected to a far larger geological trap that extends beneath multiple blocks previously thought to be separate formations. The Iran Offshore Oil Company, in partnership with domestic contractor Petropars, has confirmed through three-dimensional seismic surveys that the recoverable reserves exceed initial estimates by a factor of 4. According to reporting by Bloomberg and confirmed by regional energy consultants, Iran's petroleum minister Javad Oji stated in a press conference on April 9, 2026, that the combined Farzad B complex could produce up to 140 million cubic meters of natural gas per day once fully developed. That volume, sustained over 20 years, would generate revenues exceeding $400 billion at current European natural gas prices. Iran currently produces approximately 900 million cubic meters of gas per day from all sources combined. This single field would increase national production capacity by 15%. That number matters because it shifts Iran from a major regional gas producer to a potential rival of Qatar and Russia in global liquefied natural gas markets. Received. That is announcement number one. Announcement number two. China has already signed the extraction contracts. This is the part Western governments confirmed but have refused to discuss publicly. On March 17th, 2026, 3 weeks before Iran's public announcement of the field's full size, the China National Petroleum Corporation signed a 25-year development agreement with the National Iranian Oil Company worth an estimated $11 billion. The agreement, reported by Reuters and multiple regional officials, grants CNPC the rights to develop offshore infrastructure, construct liquefaction facilities, and purchase up to 70% of the field's output for the first decade of production. This is not speculation. This is a signed contract filed with Iran's Ministry of Economy. The agreement explicitly bypasses dollar-denominated transactions. Payment will be made in Chinese yuan, with an option for renminbi-denominated bonds or direct barter arrangements involving Chinese manufactured goods, telecommunications infrastructure, and military equipment. Stay with me because this is where the narrative completely changes and where the implications for the petrodollar system become impossible to ignore. The significance is not simply that China is buying Iranian gas. The significance is the financial architecture being constructed around this transaction. According to analysis by the International Energy Agency, China currently imports approximately 130 billion cubic meters of natural gas annually, 42% of which is liquefied natural gas transported by ship. The majority of those transactions are denominated in US dollars and settled through Western financial institutions subject to American oversight. The FARSAT-B arrangement creates a parallel payment system. Iran receives yuan, China receives energy, no American bank touches the transaction, no dollar is required as an intermediary currency, and because the gas is extracted, liquefied, and shipped entirely within infrastructure controlled by Chinese or Iranian entities, there is no point in the supply chain where Western sanctions can effectively interdict the flow. Announcement number three, and this one almost nobody in the mainstream media is connecting correctly. Saudi Arabia is now negotiating with Iran to jointly develop cross-border fields. On April 14, 2026, just 5 days after Iran's announcement, Saudi Arabia's energy minister Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman met privately with Iranian officials in Muscat, Oman. The meeting was brokered by Omani Sultan Haitham bin Tariq, who has positioned Oman as a neutral mediator in Gulf politics. According to diplomatic sources cited by the Financial Times, the discussion centered on the potential for joint development of natural gas fields that straddle the median line between Saudi and Iranian territorial waters. This represents a complete reversal of 30 years of Saudi energy policy. Saudi Arabia and Iran have not cooperated on hydrocarbon extraction since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. They have been geopolitical rivals, sectarian opponents, and proxy war antagonists. They backed opposing sides in Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. Saudi Arabia supported maximum pressure sanctions against Iran. Iran armed Houthi rebels who launched drone strikes on Saudi oil facilities, and now they are discussing joint gas development. The reason this is happening is the same reason China moved so quickly to lock in contracts. Both Saudi Arabia and China understand that the global energy market is fragmenting. The old system, where hydrocarbon resources were priced in dollars, shipped through Western-controlled maritime choke points, and insured by London-based firms operating under American legal jurisdiction, that system is being replaced by regional energy blocs with their own currencies, their own security arrangements, and their own rules. Received. That is announcement number 3. Now, let's talk about what is really happening behind the headlines, because there are two stories playing out simultaneously, and the mainstream media is only covering one of them. The story you are hearing is about Iranian sanctions evasion. You are hearing that Iran is using deceptive shipping practices, that Chinese buyers are violating international norms, that this gas development undermines efforts to pressure Iran over its nuclear program. The narrative is that this is a sanctions enforcement problem that requires more vigilance, more secondary sanctions on Chinese entities, more naval interdiction operations in the Strait of Hormuz. That narrative is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete, and the part that is being left out reveals the actual story. The actual story is that the United States no longer has the financial leverage to prevent this. Think carefully about what this represents. When the United States imposes sanctions, the enforcement mechanism is access to the dollar-based financial system. If a Chinese bank wants to do business with American firms, hold dollar reserves, or clear transactions through New York, it must comply with U.S. sanctions. That threat has been the backbone of American financial coercion for 4 decades, but here is what has changed. China's central bank now clears more than 30% of its international transactions in yuan, up from 11% in 2020. The cross-border interbank payment system, China's alternative to SWIFT, processed 47 trillion yuan in 2025, a 68% increase over 2024. The People's Bank of China has signed bilateral currency swap agreements with 84 countries, allowing direct yuan settlement without touching the dollar. What this means in practice is that a Chinese energy company can sign a contract with Iran, receive gas shipments, pay in yuan, and never interact with a financial institution subject to American jurisdiction. The transaction is invisible to U.S. regulators. There is no choke point where pressure can be applied without triggering a wider financial confrontation with China itself. The Biden administration attempted exactly this in late 2025. The Treasury Department sanctioned 3 Chinese state-owned banks for processing Iranian oil payments. China responded by threatening to dump U.S. Treasury holdings and restricting exports of rare earth elements critical to American semiconductor production. The sanctions were quietly rolled back within 6 weeks. That incident has not been widely reported, but it is documented in Federal Reserve Board meeting minutes that were released under Freedom of Information Act requests earlier this year. So when you hear analysts say that the United States should do more to enforce sanctions, what they are actually saying is that America should risk a full financial decoupling from China in order to prevent Iran from selling natural gas. And every serious strategist in Washington understands that is not a viable option. The political cost of acknowledging that reality, however, is too high. So instead, we get silence, we get non-coverage, we get the pretense that this is business as usual. If you own investments tied to energy markets, if you hold assets denominated in dollars, if you operate a business dependent on stable oil and gas prices, what is happening in the Persian Gulf is not a foreign policy story. It is a portfolio risk story. It is an inflation story. It is a currency stability story. And you are not hearing about it because the implications are too destabilizing to discuss openly. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and every time it repeats, the outcome is the same. Let me give you the parallel that matters most. The Peloponnesian War. Athens and Sparta, the 2 dominant powers in ancient Greece, went to war in 431 BC. The war lasted 27 years. Both sides exhausted themselves, tens of thousands died, entire city-states were destroyed. And who won? Persia. The Persian Empire, which had been beaten back by the Greeks decades earlier, quietly rebuilt its strength while Athens and Sparta bled each other dry. By the end of the war, Persia was again the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean. The United States is Athens. American naval power, technological superiority, democratic alliances. Iran is Sparta, land-based power, asymmetric warfare, willing to endure hardship. Both are locked in a confrontation that neither can decisively win. Sanctions hurt Iran but do not collapse the regime. Iranian proxies threaten American interests but cannot expel the United States from the region. And China is Persia. China is not fighting. China is signing contracts. China is building infrastructure. China is waiting for the 2 rivals to exhaust themselves while it quietly accumulates the one resource that matters most in the 21st century: energy security agreements that bypass the dollar system. The parallel is not exact, but the dynamic is identical. The power that stays out of the fight and focuses on economic positioning wins. The powers that engage in prolonged confrontation weaken themselves regardless of tactical victories. So where does this leave us? Let me give you 3 clear paths because there is no honest middle ground here. Path 1, diplomatic accommodation. The United States accepts that it cannot prevent Iran from developing its offshore gas reserves and shifts strategy toward multilateral frameworks that regulate the terms of extraction rather than attempting to prevent it entirely. This would require acknowledging that unilateral American sanctions are no longer enforceable and negotiating new agreements that include China, Russia, and European partners. The conditions required for this path are a willingness to compromise on Iran's nuclear program in exchange for energy market stability. The likelihood of this, given current domestic political constraints in Washington, is extremely low. Path 2, escalation and fragmentation. The United States imposes secondary sanctions on Chinese state banks involved in Iranian gas purchases, triggering a broader financial confrontation. China retaliates by restricting dollar reserve holdings and accelerating yuan internationalization. Global energy markets split into dollar block and yuan block systems. Oil and gas prices spike in Western markets while remaining stable in Asian markets. This triggers inflationary pressure in Europe and North America and accelerates the decline of dollar dominance. This path does not require intentional decisions. It can happen through bureaucratic momentum and political posturing that spirals out of control. Path 3: Managed decline. The United States quietly accepts the new reality but does not publicly acknowledge it. Sanctions remain on paper but are not aggressively enforced. Chinese and Iranian energy deals proceed without significant interference. American policymakers focus on maintaining energy security for allied states in Europe and East Asia through alternative suppliers while allowing the Persian Gulf to drift into the Chinese economic sphere. This path is what is most likely happening right now. It does not make headlines because it involves doing nothing loudly while doing very little quietly. I think we are on path 3, whether policymakers want to admit it or not. The absence of major diplomatic initiatives, the lack of military escalation despite Iranian provocations, the quiet rollback of secondary sanctions after Chinese pushback, all of this points to a strategy of managed retreat disguised as strategic patience. But the risk is that path 3 slides into path 2 without anyone intending it, because the gap between stated policy and actual enforcement creates uncertainty that markets and adversaries will exploit. Here are the questions I want you to take away. First, if Iran can develop this field without Western interdiction, which other sanctioned states will follow the same model? Venezuela has offshore gas reserves. Russia has Arctic fields. Will they also pivot to yuan-denominated contracts with Chinese state firms? Second, what happens to European energy security if Middle Eastern gas flows east instead of west? Europe currently imports 40% of its natural gas. If that supply is redirected to Asian markets, what fills the gap? Third, at what point does the dollar's role as the global reserve currency become a question rather than an assumption? Tell me in the comments what you think happens next. Tell me if you think this field actually gets developed or if geopolitical pressure will halt construction. Tell me whether you think Saudi Arabia genuinely cooperates with Iran or if this is a tactical delay. We will keep tracking every development in the Persian Gulf, in Chinese energy policy, and in the quiet restructuring of global finance that is happening while everyone is distracted by election cycles and culture war debates. That is what this channel does every single day. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with everyone in your network who is trying to understand why their energy costs keep rising despite assurances that markets are stable. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update, and we will see you in the next analysis.